Hey world, it's John Pinto, your roving realtor, bon vivant, video blogger, and I am here with Ted Stephanos from HomeGuard Natural Hazard Disclosures. How are you, Ted?
I'm doing good, John. How are you doing today?
Very good. You still Greek today?
Oh yeah, 100%.
I'm still Neapolitan, still 100% with my Greek DNA in the background. And Rafael Betances, how are you today?
I'm doing great, John. Thank you again.
Very good. I'm sure that, the Greeks found their way into your DNA somehow too, 2,700 years ago. They got around those Greeks. So, so Ted, let's talk a little bit about methamphetamines contamination disclosure, and I'll give you a little context. I remember, by way of an example, a few years ago, I heard a story, read a news article about a house in Willow Glen where they had been dumping hypodermic needles and other medical waste in the backyard. I mean, it was pretty horrendous. Now, that is not a direct comparison to what we're talking about here. And I don't get scared by too many things, but I just recently retook my real estate test, reading about all the horrible things that come along with methamphetamines infested house. We don't run into it too often, but tell us a little bit about the disclosure and what consumers need to be aware of, just in case they ever cross paths with a house that was infested with the implications of a meth lab.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the byproducts of methamphetamine production produces very toxic material. So the thing is, it's up to the owner of the property to make sure that that gets cleaned up once a meth lab gets seized and found. So the problem is, if there isn't an owner and it's a situation where it's a bank-owned property and the buyer comes in, maybe buys it at auction, and there's still remnants of a meth lab, they're going to be responsible for the cleanup. So that needs to be taken care of before close of escrow by whoever owns the property. So, and it can be very, very costly to clean up this type of contamination. It can get deep into the soil depending on where the lab was. Sometimes it might be in a garage, sometimes in a bathtub or bathroom. So sometimes it can just be something that's chucked out of on a freeway onto somebody's property as well. So that it's important to make sure that that gets cleaned up by the prior owner before you take possession of the property.
And what are the components of the disclosure that HomeGuard NHD puts out? Because I don't think I've ever read that word for word.
Yeah, well, we don't have maps or information on where the labs are. It's basically a boilerplate disclosure that NHD companies provide. And it's just a notice for the buyer to make sure that if there was a meth lab on the property, that has been cleaned up, just so they know, and just so they know that they would be responsible for that if it wasn't cleaned up.
So let's use as an example, if you had a leaky gas tank. I think the fire departments keep records of leaky gas tanks and the status of the cleanup. Is there any place that you're aware of where people could go and see if and what and where there may have been a meth lab?
Yeah, the DTSC, so it's the Department of Toxics and Substances Control, State of California. So they do keep a database that shows a list of all the cleanups. Now, it basically shows the date found and the fact that it's been cleaned up and taken care of. And that's about it, though. It's a very sparse amount of data. Now, sometimes, like I said, sometimes these labs get thrown out onto a freeway, into a field or something like that. So those are going to be kind of unlocated because there's no address or associated with those. So sometimes you're talking about leaking underground fuel tanks and the environmental reports that NHD companies provide. Sometimes those meth labs are going to be listed as an unlocated site, and just be a list. There might be, 20 of them in say Merced County or something like that. So not all of them have an address associated with it, and so that makes it a little tricky, because if it is actually contamination on somebody's property, they may have to be responsible for that cleanup.
Okay, so I may go a little bit out of your wheelhouse as I dive down the next rabbit hole. I find in 47 years of real estate practice that this issue just doesn't come up that much, at least not in Silicon Valley, at least not in the San Francisco Bay Area. But since we endeavor to make these videos educational to the broadest audience possible, is there anything that you can impart to our viewing audience on things that they should watch out for in their neighborhood if they suspect that there is a meth lab, which could be a blight on the neighborhood and is certainly a nuisance on the neighborhood?
Well, that is a good point. And that's why it's important also to do the walkthrough with the agent inspection as well prior to
Right.
prior to buying the property.
Right. So my question to you is just from a broader standpoint to people that just own their homes, they're in a neighborhood, they've seen some sketchy characters coming and going. Are there, in your capacity with natural hazard disclosures, do you have any insight as to hints, indications that there would be an active meth lab in a neighborhood as people are driving by or smelling things or what have you?
Well, yeah, I guess it's common sense at that point, and if it's not, so you're asking kind of like in one of those Nextdoor apps, like, are you going to post that on Facebook or Nextdoor if there's suspicious activity going on? That's always up to an individual homeowner. But, this type of contamination, these meth labs, they usually are contained like on the site. It's not going to be something like that's going to contaminate a whole neighborhood or a toxic plume. It's usually a smaller, it's not like one of these super, like I'm thinking of Breaking Bad, how they had the underground lab going on under the laundromat, where it was a major production going on. Usually these are in a bathtub or in a garage, something smaller, not a
So it's a smaller scale. Okay, very good. Well, it's good to know that while we're enduring the existing apocalypse with bad air quality and COVID-19, obviously meth labs are not something that are going to create a plume and are going to be localized. So that's good work. So I guess I'm glad that this is not a major issue unless you happen to be probably buying a foreclosure, and you better make sure you understand the history of that property.
Yeah, that's a really good point, especially with those, as-is sales, or those, we had many of these foreclosures like 10 years ago that these situations would come up because they're bought in auctions and things, but much less these days. But that's why it's so important to do that, those inspections before close of escrow, so you know exactly what you're getting into, whether it's anything from termites to flaws in the home to a meth lab. That it's really important to have that checked out first.
Good. And I will punctuate what you're saying. Every now and then I will have someone, a buyer, a seller, a realtor, or what have you, say, well, it's an as-is sale, so we don't need inspections. I say there is a big difference between as-is when you have no idea what you're buying and as-is when you have all the inspections and you know exactly what as-is means. So a word to the wise. Very good. So if people want to contact you, Ted, to get more information on natural hazard disclosure or order a report, how do they contact you?
Yeah, they can come to HomeGuard.com and click on the natural hazard disclosure section of the webpage, and all the information is there on how to get a hold of us.
Likewise, Rafael, if they want to do the same with the roof termite home inspection, how do they contact you?
Absolutely. You guys can either text me or you can call me at 707-616-8762, or you can email me at rbetances@homeguard.com. That's the letter R, my last name at homeguard.com.
Thank you, gentlemen, for imparting that information. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next page.